Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything: politics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find the show here at American Freedom Radio, AmericanFreedomRadio.com, as well as on my website, which is PorkinsPolicyReview.com. And if you are new to the show, there are lots of ways to listen. You can find me on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Play, Player FM. I'm also on Podbean as well, which is another podcatcher. I wasn't even aware that I was on that, but I am. You can also, of course, follow the show through RSS feed on YouTube, and I am rebroadcast on Friday nights on a host of other networks, including People's Internet Radio, AwakeRadio.us. I'm on Ed Opperman's Spreaker channel, and there are lots of ways also to, listen. You can, of course, find everything archived here at American Freedom Radio and also on my website as well. If you want to support my work, you can also go to Patreon and you can become a subscriber for as little as $1 a month, which of course gives you access to the exclusive bonus podcast, which I will be recording hopefully very soon. And I'll let everybody know what that's about probably next week. And very quickly, I just wanted to thank Ilya for a very lovely donation and wonderful note, lovely note as well on PayPal just recently. And Ilya, I will be writing you a proper thank you email, but I did want to mention, it was a very, very sweet gesture. And I actually really needed that money that particular week. So thank you so much. And of course, if you want to support me, you can also go to PayPal and make a donation. That's always acceptable. And of course, I hope that everyone supports American Freedom Radio as well, which also has Patreon and PayPal. And of course, without them, I wouldn't be here talking with you. And I'll stop rambling on and get to today's show because I'm very excited. This week, I am joined on the line from Venezuela by journalist Paul Dobson, who writes for VenezuelaAnalysis.com. Which is a must-follow website. I think I've mentioned it a couple times now on the show in the past, but it is an excellent source for alternative news in terms of what's going on in Venezuela. We're going to be talking about this recent assassination attempt on President Nicolas Maduro, sanctions, and a whole lot more. But Paul Dobson, how are you? It's good to finally be speaking with you.
Hi there, Piers. Yeah, great to be on your show today. Thanks very much for having me, and it's always great to support the alternative press outlets in the United States as well.
Excellent. Oh yeah, no, certainly. And there seem to be fewer and fewer truly, independent and interesting outlets out there. Paul, before we kind of dive into what will be, I think, a very wide-ranging discussion today. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself? Who is Paul Dobson, and how did you come to end up living in Venezuela?
Well, I'm British by origin, Scottish. British. My passport says British. Yeah, I've lived in Venezuela now for a long time, since the government of Hugo Chavez, and obviously the current government of Nicolas Maduro. I work here as a journalist for the independent media outlet VenezuelaAnalysis.com, which is basically a grassroots website. It's the only English language media outlet in Venezuela. It's non-cooperative, it's not mainstream media. We generally support the Bolivarian process, but we're also very critical about certain elements going on at the moment. So it's anyone looking for news on Venezuela, independent news, let's say, rather than pro-government sources or White House-backed sources. Like you mentioned, it's a must-read news source for them.
Absolutely. And, unfortunately there is so much disinformation when it comes to Venezuela, particularly here in the U.S. And Venezuela Analysis is like one of the only, really truly independent and very fascinating. Like you said too, you don't, it's not like a pro-Maduro, pro-government website. There are critical views. You're very, open to a variety of opinions on stuff like that. And I think we'll have a discussion like that today. Very briefly though, I wanted to mention it here, just a little bit in the first hour, and we'll get into more of it in the second hour, but it is today is a special day, Paul, because it's an International Day of Solidarity against the U.S. And Canadian sanctions in Venezuela. So briefly, just tell the listeners a little bit about that. You sent me a very interesting like a press statement on that, and I want to just mention here at the top of the first hour, and we'll get more into it in the second hour, but just briefly touch on what this is.
Yeah, well, it's a very important piece. Following international sanctions which have been mounted against not just the Venezuelan state, the government and president, but also the Venezuelan people, the country itself, there has been formed a international coalition, let's call it, of activists, of grassroots movements in the US and in Canada, and they're starting to expand to other parts of the world as well, which opposes these sanctions, which have initially stemmed from the White House, but as you pointed out, have since come out of Canada, Panama, Switzerland, and a few other countries as well have joined in. This is the first International Day of Action which has been called for today, so I think it's very important that we discuss Venezuela and these sanctions today. There was action going on in numerous different cities across the United States, outside the Venezuelan consulates and embassies, as well as in Canada, pickets and protests and rallies, which are basically uniting under the common banner that these sanctions are illegal. These sanctions are declared illegal by the United Nations. These sanctions have been declared illegal by the Organization of American States in their statutes. They are illegal. And these sanctions are basically strangling Venezuela. They're not helping anyone. They're not helping the economic situation. They're not helping the Venezuelans. They're not helping to resolve food scarcity. They're not helping to resolve any of the hyperinflation, anything like that that's going on. But they are designed exactly to make these problems worse for political gain for the White House. So there's a whole series of actions going on at the moment. There's a Twitter campaign which has been going on all day under the hashtag Sanctions Are War and the hashtag End Venezuela Sanctions. So I'd encourage all of your listeners to activate themselves in Twitter as well as in Facebook. You can search for the International Day of Action on Facebook, and you'll find more information about some of the activities that have been going on. So I think it's very important that we hold our conversation today in this context, Piers.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, we'll link up to all of that in the show notes. But as I said, we'll get into this in more depth in the second hour in terms of the sanctions, and like you said, really kind of this collective punishment, which is of course exacerbating an economic problem, which in most ways is really being puppeteered by the Western banks and governments. And as I said, we'll get into that. But yeah, we should kind of just keep that in context and keep that in the back of our mind as we move on to what is a huge topic, which unfortunately, in my estimation, didn't get nearly the kind of coverage here in the alternative Western media, let alone the mainstream media, and that is the recent assassination attempt on the current president of Venezuela, the newly elected Nicolas Maduro. Now, this happened on August 4th during a military ceremony, which I believe it was honoring the National Guard of Venezuela, and several drones, allegedly packed with like a kilo of C4, exploded during Maduro's speech. Panic ensued. People started running for their lives. Several people were injured. There's some pictures of some soldiers and other people covered in blood. And several people have been arrested. There's also been some warrants that have been issued against some high-profile right-wing figures, which we'll get to just in a moment. Several members of the armed forces have also been arrested. But before we dive into the aftermath and the specifics of who these people are, Paul, break down for the listeners what we actually know about the day in question on August 4th. Paint a picture for what actually happened.
Okay, so August 4th was a Saturday. There was a fairly regular military parade going through the largest street in the center of Caracas, in Venezuela's capital, Caracas, which is the Avenue Simón Bolívar. It was celebrating the 81st anniversary of the National Guard, as you pointed out. And obviously there was a whole range of public there, a whole range of the government team, the high military command and press and so on and so on. It's a public activity. Around 5:40 in the afternoon, 5:41 exactly, the president was in the middle of his national address, which is a regular period of these activities, when he got distracted on live TV, started looking towards the sky, as did his wife, who stood beside him, and the defense minister, who also stood on this platform with them. And very shortly after, the live TV stream cut out, which meant that all of the people who were watching were left in uncertainty as to what had happened. Very shortly afterwards, one of the vice presidents of Venezuela, called Jorge Rodriguez, came out onto national TV and radio and gave a statement and explained what had happened. And what had happened was this. There had been 2 drones flown very close to the presidential platform. One had been disorientated by the military signal and had crashed into a nearby tower block and exploded. The other one had been shot down by a military sniper. We saw pictures of the presidential bodyguard covering the president and rushing him away moments after this. And what has pursued after these events is a series of statements from the government, a series of independent video footage which have come out from the crowd, and a series of groupings in Venezuela and outside Venezuela who have accepted responsibility for this. Only minutes after this attack, a right-wing Twitter account, anonymous Twitter account called Soldiers in T-shirts, claimed responsibility for this attack. I'd like to read the tweet they sent out just minutes after this attack, which said exactly: the operation was to fly 2 drones carrying C4 explosive to the presidential platform. Presidential Guard snipers shot them down before they arrived at their objective. We showed them that they are vulnerable. Today we didn't achieve it, but it's only a question of time. This was the tweet which was sent out about an hour after this attack. This makes it very clear that the objective of this attack was to kill the president. Obviously, an objective they failed to achieve at this point. Following this attack, so this was about a week ago now, 10 days ago, there has been an ongoing investigation by police authorities in Venezuela. 25 people have been accused of forming part of the organization of this attack. Some have been arrested, some are being searched for by the police. And they range from drone drivers to car drivers to logistical operators to people who finance this operation. But they also include a series of high-profile right-wing politicians who, at the very least, knew the attack was happening and, at the most, were involved actively in the logistics and the organization of this attack. And this is a very serious affair, as you rightly pointed out. The press, the world's press, has paid very little attention to this attack, and the attention they have paid has been, to some extent, in mockery, putting assassination attack in inverted commas, for example.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you and your listeners, if somebody drove 2 drones carrying C4 explosive to President Trump, which were shot down just meters from his face, what would be the reaction of the U.S. press?
Of course. Well, as you point out there, Paul, the inverted commas and all the usual suspects: Reuters, BBC, the New York Times, and the prevailing theory amongst the Western press is that, of course, this, and they won't use the term false flag, because, that has all sorts of connotations that they dislike. But that's what they are accusing. They're saying that Maduro orchestrated this entire thing. This is all him. Within moments of, or not moments, but later that day, we had John Bolton on Fox News, basically saying that, this was probably Maduro who did it, and we should really support the far right in Venezuela, which is fighting for democracy, and, they hate him. Oddly, he kind of confirmed both. He says that Maduro did it, but we should support the right wing that are trying to actively overthrow him, but they didn't do it. I just wanted to just say, this makes zero sense. If you just look at it objectively, let's say that Maduro is the evil dictator, this caricature that he gets portrayed as. It makes no sense, Paul. Why would they even put him in danger? And furthermore, I know this is hard for a lot of people to swallow, but he is extremely popular within Venezuela. I don't think he needs to plan some sort of a terrorist attack to gain more support or anything like that. And also, it doesn't make the president of a country look good when you see them, cowering in fear, which is what I would be doing if there were drones exploding over my head. So this whole premise that it's all being orchestrated is BS. And furthermore, as you've pointed out in some of your articles for Venezuela Analysis, there are just a litany of right-wing figures that have been coming out of the woodwork claiming responsibility for this. Just off the bat, let's talk about this Patricia Palayo, who's a Venezuelan journalist in Miami. she read a even longer statement from this the T-shirt army. Correct, Paul?
Yes, correct. This was very, very shortly after the attack. I think about an hour and a half after the attack. Patricia Palayo is to some extent, infamous journalist here in Venezuela. Very right wing, very open in her criticism both of Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro and the government, which of course is her right. She quite a while ago left Venezuela and currently lives in Miami in the US, and has a regular TV program there, under the news network Factors of Power, which is a very well-financed news network in Miami. So she came out onto her TV program and said that she had received a statement, an anonymous statement about this attack. She then professed to say this was not her opinion, she was just going to read it and she wasn't going to take any questions, and she proceeded to read a public statement from this grouping, the soldiers in T-shirts who claimed the attack, which more or less backs up what they said on Twitter and also expands a little bit more. In the statement that she read out, the grouping alleged to a few objectives behind this attack. They clearly say the objective was to assassinate the president. They cite constitutional reasons, and they call for new elections in the country, and they call for a transition government to be formed. So it's very interesting, the link between the Twitter account, which has claimed responsibility for this attack, the statement read out by a very right-wing Venezuelan journalist based in Miami, and since then we've had another element which has been added to this calculation, which is the Peruvian journalist Jamie Bailey, who has a TV program also in the United States called Bailey. It's also aired here in Latin America on NTN 24. I think in the US it's aired by Mega TV. Jamie Bailey on his program openly stated that before the attack took place, he had been called to a meeting, he didn't say by who, to discuss an assassination attempt on Maduro, which means that he had previous knowledge that this attack was going to happen. He doesn't mention whether he got involved or did not. He was a little bit coy about this. But the fact that a journalist, with all press responsibility and the responsibility which being a journalist brings with it and the freedom of speech brings with it, can openly say that he knew that there was going to be a terrorist attack and took no measure against it, is outrageous.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's like, again, just flip the script. I mean, can you imagine if there was an Al-Qaeda attack in America again, and you had a major journalist saying, "Oh, well, I knew about it," days in advance.
Exactly.
I mean, it is crazy. Also that he, like you said, I mean, he doesn't report this. He doesn't say anything. And this is just like one in a series of people in the far right-wing circles in Latin America that have come forward talking about prior knowledge to this. There's also again, which I think should dispel any and all suggestion that Maduro orchestrated this. You've also got the former police chief, Salvatore Lucchesi, who lives in exile in Bogota. I mean, he told Reuters that he helped organize the thing, right?
Exactly. And he, again, is a very well-known opposition activist here, right-wing activist. I think it's very important, Piers, that, we stress that we have to look at the concrete evidence which we have. No? Yeah. If this had just been the case that the government or the interior minister in Venezuela had come out and said there had been an attack against the president, we would have two options. Either we believe him or we don't. No? But in this case, this isn't what happened. We have a series of elements which we can objectively verify, and when we bring them all together, we can draw our own conclusions. No? We shouldn't believe the story told to us by the Venezuelan government necessarily. We shouldn't necessarily believe the story told to us by John Bolton either. No? Right. So when I talk about these series of elements, what am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about, on one hand, the story of the government in Venezuela have told us of what happened and who is behind it. Okay. We've also got independently, we've got people claiming responsibility, as we've just mentioned, Twitter accounts, press statements, which have got nothing to do with the Venezuelan government. But we also have a third element, which is concrete, on-the-ground evidence by people who are at the military parade. No? So in the days following the attack, we've had a series of amateur footage come to light. People are recording them a parade on their phones or whatever. It's also an area of Caracas where there's a lot of tower blocks, so a lot of people from their windows would have been watching the parade. And we've seen a series of amateur footage which show the drones flying in, show one of the drones hitting a tower block, show one of the drones exploding in midair. There's also testimony from a series of citizens of Caracas, because three of the perpetrators of the attack were actually caught by members of the public upon leaving the tower block with their drone equipment. They were caught by interested bystanders, let's say, supporters of the government who were there at the military parade, because they were acting suspiciously and were handed in to the police authorities. So there was a whole group of people out on the street who saw people with remote control equipment for flying drones, and so on and so on. So when we bring all of this on-the-ground footage with the story we've been told by the Venezuelan government, and we combine this with the story we've heard from these people like Lucchesi, who from Colombia says, yes, I was part of this, I was a foot soldier in this organization, and our objective was to kill the president. So when we bring all of these elements in together, there's a very strong case which corroborates the series of events which we understand took place. Now, obviously, there's always elements, especially in the U.S. mainstream media, which look to promote some idea that there's a massive rift in Venezuela, that there's elements within Maduro's government who organize this behind his back, that this was the military who actually opposed the government, and so on and so on, because this is what creates good headlines for them, maybe, and as such, excellent financing and sponsorship. But in this case, I think all objectivity points in the opposite direction, that this was organized by a group of right-wing activists in Venezuela with the support of people in Bogota, with the support of people in Miami, which I think we should talk about a little bit later on. This grouping, Soldiers in T-shirts, was founded right in the heat of the 2014 violent street protests, which were equally organized by the extreme right-wing groupings in Venezuela, which looked to, through violence, overthrow the democratic government of Nicolas Maduro. So in March 2014, this group Soldiers in T-shirts was founded. We don't know who organized it. We don't know who's behind it. They're not public. And this is a group which is 10 days ago tried to assassinate the president. So everything correlates. Everything corroborates the story which we can build up around this assassination attempt.
Absolutely, and that's what I found fascinating with the way that this narrative is sort of playing out, is that like these right-wing groupings, as you point out, are actually pretty vocal, confirming that this is what was going on. They're not really hiding the fact. Now, of course, we've certain elements have kind of denied it. I mean, Maduro was pretty quick to point to Colombia and the outgoing president, Juan Manuel Santos, as one of the ringleaders in this. And listeners are probably aware, but we should just remind everyone, Colombia has just recently became even closer with NATO and is now essentially a NATO country, NATO member. So, bringing it even farther to this right-wing military alliance. And, on top of that, they've long been the enforcer for the U.S. in that particular region. And, I just wanted to point out, I found it wonderful that Santos's response, that he couldn't have been involved because he was at his granddaughter's baptism. So I guess implying that he wasn't piloting one of these drones, or he wasn't, in the situation room or organizing it, as if, because he was at his granddaughter's baptism, he couldn't have possibly have been involved on some level. But, Paul, I'd also like to kind of bring in the other layer to this, and that is this, the right-wing activists in Venezuela, but also in Bogota, because this is kind of, this is another sort of factor in all of this. And I mean, we've got, Julio Borges, who I would love for you to get into, who's in exile, again, in, Bogota, which seems to be where most of the right-wing Venezuelan, leaders, hang out in. And there's also, and I'm going to butcher his name, Juan Requesens, who was recently detained by SEBIN, which is the Venezuelan intelligence, in connection with the assassination attempt. So expand this a little bit, because both of these two figures are members of the First Justice Party, which is infamous in Venezuela, and particularly Borges seems to be at the center of this whole entire plot. So let's talk a little bit about both of these individuals.
Yes, well, this isn't the first time that here in Venezuela we've seen prominent right-wing leaders, extreme right-wing leaders, I should point out, directly involved in violent action to overthrow the Venezuelan state. It's worth, before we get into these two personalities that you've mentioned, pointing out the following. Put yourselves in the shoes of a Venezuelan right-wing activist. So, 1999, a government comes to power which is at that point nationalist, and then switched or shifted leftwards as they went on. Started nationalizing industries, promoted social policies for the poor, and so on and so on. A right-wing activist in Venezuela obviously was opposed to these sorts of policies. And since 1999, the Venezuelan right-wing, I'm not talking necessarily about the political parties here, but the groupings of activists, have tried a series of policies or a series of attempts to overthrow this government or overthrow these social policies, which have essentially tried to redistribute the oil wealth of the country. So these right-wing groupings have tried to win at elections. They've on numerous occasions they've tried to overthrow the government through the ballot box, through democratic constitutional methods. In this coming December, Venezuela will see the 25th election since 1999. Of the 24 elections we've had so far, the right-wing groupings have won 2. Which means they've lost 22 of 24 elections. Not been a great policy for them. What else have they tried? They've tried to kidnap the president. 2002. They organized a military insurrection against President Chavez, who kidnapped him temporarily, flew him out of the country, and only through the extent of popular rebellion against these policies was he brought back and reinstated. This didn't work for them either. We've seen them try economic lockouts which is basically a boycott of the economy. Shutting shops, paying people not to sell, paying people not to do business, blocking roads. This hasn't worked for them either. We've seen them set up barricades. We've seen them try to burn down public institutions, schools, nurseries, transport networks, anything that smells of the government in 2014 and 2017. This didn't work for them either. We've seen calls for an international invasion. This hasn't happened so far. At the moment, we're seeing their efforts for international sanctions and isolation. So far, the government is still here. So in this context, the Venezuelan right-wing groupings must be, if I was one of them, which I'm not, I would feel extremely frustrated in this context. They've tried a series of policies, none of which of these have worked. They tried boycotting election. They tried participating. They tried throwing money at elections. None of it has worked for them. So what is one of their last resorts? An assassination attempt. Something a lot more direct, something a lot more violent. And this hasn't worked for them either.
No.
They must be feeling pretty low at the moment. So that's a context I just wanted to give you. Now let's talk a little bit about Julio Borges and Juan Requesens. These are both members of parliament here in Venezuela, or the National Assembly as we call it here. Julio Borges was for a long time the president of the National Assembly. They're both very right-wing members of parliament. If you look at their previous press statements and policy positions which they've assumed, they are not just against the government, but they are vehemently, violently against the government. And how have they been implicated in this assassination attempt is one of the major questions that we should be looking at. Well, one of the implications is the following. The people who have so far been arrested for this assassination attempt, which are mostly the base level people involved in the logistics, the car drivers, the drone operators and so on, most of them have confessed. And these confessions have in part been publicized. You can find them on the social networking, you can find them on the internet. The Venezuelan government and the police authorities combined here in Venezuela have publicized these confessions. Why have they publicized them? Because these confessions all point and all name these two personalities, these two members of parliament. So this isn't Paul Dobson saying that Julio Borges was involved. This isn't Nicolas Maduro saying Julio Borges was involved. These are the people who were paid and who actually carried out the attack, saying, according to them, Julio Borges and Juan Requesens were involved. I can't testify as to whether they were or were not. I haven't seen all of the evidence. But the confessions of not one, but at least three of those accused of being involved in this assassination attempt point towards these personalities. Julio Borges is currently in Bogota. You say he's exiled. Exiled to me has a slightly different meaning. Maybe he's in self-exile.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. He's not, but he's choosing to live there.
Yes, he is still an active member of parliament, but at least since February this year, he hasn't been in Venezuela. He's abandoned his responsibilities as a member of parliament. He lives in a extremely large house in Bogota, and in the recent months, he's visited the White House. He's had coffee with Trump. He's been to Miami. He's met a whole range of presidents and prime ministers and so on and so on. Talking about Venezuela and his perspective on the current government. Juan Requesens, on the other hand, is in Venezuela. He has been arrested on Tuesday last week. He was arrested shortly after his name was publicly mentioned in these confessions. He was arrested alongside his sister. His sister has since been released, and he is currently on trial. His trial started yesterday for this member of parliament. It's worth pointing out that both himself and Borges constitutionally enjoyed parliamentary immunity in Venezuela. This immunity was removed by the High Supreme Court on Wednesday last week, which means they are now open to criminal and legal proceedings as per any other citizen. Just to give you an idea of who this parliamentary member Juan Requesens is, previous statements of his include openly calling for a U.S. invasion of Venezuela as the only means to get rid of the Maduro government. Julio Borges, if you look a little bit into Julio Borges was very active in the 2002 coup d'etat against Hugo Chavez, which I previously mentioned. He was very active in supporting the de facto government, which installed itself briefly, less than 48 hours they were in government. He was active in this movement in 2002. So these are people who have a historical background. These are people who are not adverse to sitting down with right-wing factors outside of Venezuela, in the United States, in the White House, in Bogota, in Madrid, in Panama City, in other places, and who have used violence in the past as a political tool. So this is a summary, let's say, of who these people are. Again, I want to make it clear. I'm not saying these people are guilty. I don't know. I'm not in charge of the police investigation. They have been directly accused, directly involved, and the investigation and the trial will obviously find out their level of guilt or innocence.
And I also wanted to point out, Borges is also supposedly he was had held meetings with the newly elected president of Colombia and his cabinet, as well as our lovely UN ambassador Nikki Haley, and he also met with this woman Kristen Madison, who is the Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. And I just bring her up only because she's a fascinating character, someone that people should look into. She's a very shady background. She worked for the Organization of American States and was also back in the day worked for the State Department in Nicaragua and openly called for Ortega to be overthrown, and we're already seeing that Ortega and his government is seeing a protest movement that very much has the fingerprints of external, Western NGOs all over it, and looks very similar to protests that we saw most recently in 2017 in Venezuela. So, he's kind of up to his eyeballs in a lot of this shady stuff, and as you point out, is implicated in 2002. I guess I wanted to just, to play devil's advocate, to be a contrarian with this. A lot of people will instantly kind of say, Paul, well, everyone is a Maduro appointee. I know that Requesens has said that, his lawyers have said they don't have access to him. I know there's a video of him from prison, which doesn't look great, but it doesn't look, terrible, but it doesn't look okay, basically. And it's just showing him maybe in soiled underwear. How do you respond to that kind of stuff? And again, I would just sort of point out that, while it may not be, I think people use their own legal system and say, oh, well, how could they do this, with maybe not understanding the legal system in Venezuela or how these things work. And, I guess just to play devil's advocate, what do you say to those sort of people?
Well, just as you were phrasing that question, it just conjured up images in my head. Let's not get into this too much, but conjured up images in my head of waterboating of Guantanamo Bay and what the US government does to the people they accuse of working against it. But that's a completely different issue, of course. So yes, Juan Requesens was arrested by the intelligence authorities. He is being held in a holding cell. Like I say, he's now on trial. I personally have never been arrested by the intelligence authorities in any country, but I imagine it's not a particularly pleasant procedure anywhere in the world. I know very well I've heard very well from personal testimony what the MI6 do in London, for example, the MI5 and MI6. I would imagine the FBI do similar things in the United States. I don't know. What is certain is that we can see that this personality, Juan Requesens, is a very principled man. He is a very strong man. We can see by his actions in 2017 when he led a lot of the street protests against the government. He organized a lot of students and people around him. He's not a weak personality. He is very convinced of his anti-government feelings. To make or to force a person of this nature, this characteristic, to say something against their will, I would imagine would involve a serious amount of persuasion or violent action. The videos of his confessions, which we have seen, definitely do not show this. They don't show him in a great limelight. You know, he's been in a cell, he's been questioned, he's been arrested, he hasn't seen his family for a while, I don't know, of course. But I can't really comment about what's been going on behind the camera, because I don't know. The conclusion I can draw is this, that this isn't a weak man. This is somebody who has shown himself to be very principled and very strong. For him to come out and implicate one of his party members in the First Justice Party by name, if it were not true, or if it were not in his interests, maybe he's been offered a lower sentence, I don't know. We don't have details on this at the moment. But if this were not true, then I find this extremely strange from a person like him. You know? We also have to look a little bit at the historical context of this to point towards whether this may be genuine or not. His party, whether one of the major parties behind the recent violent activity seen in Venezuela in 2014 and 2017, his colleagues in the party were some of the leaders of all of the nastiest violent activities we've seen under the name of politics in Venezuela in recent years. And so there is definitely precedent for this situation, which I think is an important factor when we start to judge who these people are. These are no angels. These are no angels. Their record and their history show that. That of course doesn't make them guilty for what they're being accused of now. No, but it does show a little bit of who they are.
Oh yeah, and I mean I agree with you, Paul. And like you said, these guys are no angels. They have a history of this. I mean, again, when you're openly calling for either a military coup or for the U.S. to invade Venezuela and help you to gain power, I mean, you should expect the kid gloves are probably going to be off. And yeah, I mean, I think it's totally appropriate to bring up how we treat people in Guantanamo or other things. I mean, listen, when a terrorist is accused of doing something in America, I mean, we don't even see the video footage of them in prison because we don't even know what prison they're in. They disappear in, not to get too off topic, but a lot of times, people that are accused of terrorism here are disappeared into a secretive part of the federal prison system where their location is not revealed. They're constantly moved around. And it's like a prison within a prison system. And, so let's kind of keep that in mind. And also, again, like you said, I mean, if you're accused of something like this and it's the intelligence, state that is picking you up, the intelligence services, security services, it's probably not going to be pretty. And also, because I know that this has been, I've seen lots of people on Twitter, bitching about this. This whole, they were stripped of their parliamentary immunity. I mean, that to me is kind of insane that even still exists. Okay? Can you just explain that, Paul? Because my understanding is that you basically, I guess as long as you're in Parliament or the National Assembly, you can't be accused of a crime? I mean, is that what that is referring to? Because, I mean, again, that's insane. Can you imagine if congressmen here or senators weren't allowed to be arrested? Or, I mean, what is the parliamentary immunity? How does that work?
Essentially, yes. An active member of Parliament is immune from criminal proceedings while they are active. No? So in this particular case, the Supreme Court in Venezuela requested basically what is a superpower here in Venezuela at the moment, which is a constituent assembly, and I'll just explain what that is in a second, to strip these two members of Parliament of their parliamentary immunity. This has happened in the past. This happened with a another right-wing activist called Maria Corina Machado, who again was calling for U.S. intervention directly into Venezuela, and has been accused of treason against the country. So her parliamentary immunity was also stripped a few years ago. The body which stripped this, the Constituent Assembly, this is a body which was voted in by Venezuelans in July last year. It's a perfectly constitutional body, according to Venezuelan law and Venezuelan constitution, which has the purpose of rewriting or drawing up a draft for a new constitution. And whilst in existence, it constitutionally works above every other power of state which normally exists. No? The Constitutional Assembly is a temporary body. It's not a permanent body. It serves a purpose, and when it serves its purpose, it ceases to exist. But while it does exist, it is above and has overarching power from the other 5 powers of state which in Venezuela historically exist. Now, which are the obviously the government, the executive power of state, the legal power of state, which is an independent power of state, the electoral power of state, which is again independent, the elected system, which is the National Assembly, and so on, and the citizens' power, which is another independent power of state. So you have this overarching National Constituent Assembly, which has a power basically to take these sort of measures while it exists. So this is a body which stripped them of their parliamentary immunity. It's all entirely constitutional, entirely legal according to Venezuelan law, and there's nothing more to be said on this issue, I think.
Yeah, well, and I think this is just this. I wanted to bring it up only because there's such a disconnect, and people hear that, I can't believe this is going on, and they truly don't understand how the law works in Venezuela, or just how the law is different from the way that we use the law. One of the reasons that people often struggle to believe this sort of thing happens is not because they find the legal proceedings beyond belief, but it's because it's often hard to grasp the fact, especially coming from the Western society, hard to grasp the fact that yes, a man or a woman who has been elected as a member of parliament or as a senator could be involved in such dirty proceedings. Yeah.
This does happen. Yes, we need to open up our minds a little bit. I don't know if this happens in the US. I wouldn't be surprised. But here in Venezuela, the fact that he is a National Assembly deputy doesn't mean that he is an angel, again, to use the word. There are people who with positions of power here in Venezuela who, yes, resort to violent strategies to get more power. This is a reality. And so this isn't beyond belief. People need to maybe open up their minds a little bit, and when you start dismantling the fact that this title doesn't give him any sort of moral superiority, or doesn't mean that he is an angel, then we start looking into his actions and then saying, if he has committed a crime, then surely he should be tried, or he should be held to an account as any other citizen should be. The fact that he has a title makes no difference, no?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then we start dismantling the whole idea of this, and we can start looking at the parliamentary immunity in a new light, I think.
Oh, certainly. And again, that to me is just nutty that you can even have that kind of immunity. Yeah, I mean, and again, too, people find that it kind of even applies here. I mean, where you see, when congressmen or senators, politicians get into real big trouble, they always cut a deal. So it exists even, it's sort of in name only.
Yeah, maybe not officially, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, again, I think we need to also kind of dismiss this idea. Again, so many people, and again, I think we're preaching to the choir here, but people will believe that Maduro is capable of this, but no one else, the right wing in Venezuela, they would never want to use violence. Now, Maduro, yes, he loves to use violence. He wants to oppress everyone. He is this, horrible dictator. But no, the right wing, they would never do that. Even though you have people like John Bolton going on Fox News and essentially, saying that they're wonderful and that the right wing should continue to destabilize Venezuela through violent means.
It's worth pointing out as well to your listeners that When we talk about the Venezuelan right wing, we're not talking about a homogenous grouping here. There are very different traits within the right wing in Venezuela, which have taken very different stances, both towards the recent elections and this assassination attempt against Maduro. No? When we're talking generally about this assassination attempt and these people, these personalities, these groupings, we're talking about the ultra-right, the extreme right. Yeah. There is a much more moderate right wing in Venezuela, political parties, community movements, and so on and so on. Religious groupings as well, which stick within the constitutional confines of political action, entirely legal, entirely peaceful, and they have a very important support base here within Venezuela, without a doubt. So I just want to clarify this. When we're talking about these groups, we're talking about the extreme right here in Venezuela, not the whole of the right-wing group.
Right. No. And again, too, like you said, I mean, I don't want to make that distinction because I know that, a lot of the, right-leaning conservative groups in Venezuela actively participate in, democracy in the government there and have a voice and, are not like this sort of, like you said, extreme right. And also just wanted to throw out there again, because I think it's always worth pointing out, but this extreme right-wing groupings in Venezuela and in general in Latin America is also, has a lot of racial overtones to it as well. And if you look up, pictures of Requesens or Borges and others, they are European descent. These are white guys basically. And we should just keep that in mind as well. There is a racial component to this far right wing politics all over Latin America, which have always sought to oppress people of color within those countries and are basically, they're European, they're Spanish, who, feel that they're endowed with some sort of, right to rule over everybody. And of course with, very strong connections to, big business within Venezuela. So just keep that in mind as well. We're getting up towards the end of the first hour, Paul, and, in the second hour I want to kind of expand the conversation, get into some of the economic warfare that's going on in Venezuela, and there's a few other little points I wanted to bring up in the second hour as well. But speaking strictly on the assassination attempt, is there anything you wanted to add to this? Anything that we might have missed? Anything that we should be sort of looking forward to, or keeping an eye on in terms of the investigation unfolding?
Yeah, I think there's one very important element which we haven't talked about yet, which is regarding a certain gentleman, a Venezuelan man called Osman Delgado Tabosky, which is definitely not a typical Venezuelan surname. Osman Delgado Tabosky lives in the United States. He may be a neighbor of some of your listeners, I don't know, or you may go to church with him, or anyone might know Osman Delgado Tabosky. Osman Delgado Tabosky is being accused by the Venezuelan police forces of being one of the major financiers of funders of this terrorist act. What we know about Tabosky is that he has lived in Miami for some years now. We know very little about him politically or his groupings, or very little information has been made public so far. What we do know is that President Maduro publicly accepted an offer strangely by the FBI to look into this man Tabosky, which I found very, very generous on behalf of the FBI. I think we'd have to be careful to find out whether they do their investigation with the sort of rigor we would hope they do it with. But anyway, they have offered to look into Tabosky. So he's being accused of funding all of this activity. I mean, the mere drones themselves, which were used in the attack, cost $5,000 a head. Plus all of the C4 explosives, which I would imagine are fairly expensive as well, and the logistics and everything else. So there is this terrorist cell which carried on. I think it's important we use this word terrorist. A lot of the mainstream media is avoiding this word. They're using a assassination attempt or attack. This isn't a terrorist attack. This is on a par with the terrorist attacks in France, in Canada, in London, and of course in the United States. So one of the elements of this terrorist cell, it seems to be based also in Miami. So everyone keep their eyes open for Osman Delgado Tabosky.
Well, absolutely, and we, maybe we'll pick up a little bit on Tabosky in the second hour. I'm speaking with Paul Dobson of VenezuelaAnalysis.com, so please stay tuned.
Welcome to the world's meeting place. American.
Practically narcotic.
Freedom.
Oh, yes. I like very much.
Radio.
You're an American institution.
American Freedom Radio.
Simply Clean Foods is dedicated to providing the best quality food you can buy next to fresh from a farmer's market. Our stringent quality controls and absolute zero GMOs plus testing for heavy metals makes us unique in the storable foods market. Our line of fruits, vegetables, and meats are suitable for everyday use, and you won't have to worry about throwing away valuable groceries ever again. Take out the amount you need and reseal the package for use within the next 6 months. Simply Clean Foods' primary focus is to bring clean food to people all around the world and change the way we look at freeze-dried food in our daily cooking. Go to simplycleanfoods.net. That's www.simplycleanfoods.net today.
This is Rick Simpson, and you're listening to American Freedom Radio.
American Survival Wholesale is a proud sponsor of the American Freedom Radio. And when you purchase quality products from AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com, you help support this program. Our quality non-GMO foods do not contain MSG, high fructose corn syrup, or heavy metals. At American Survival Wholesale, you can choose from over 8,000 quality products, including self-defense weapons, bug-out bags, and long-term storable food at wholesale prices. We also have custom food packs available, including gluten-free, dairy-free, and vegetarian packs. If we don't have it, you don't need it. American Survival Wholesale is a veteran-owned and operated company which also supports our veterans in need, and we are very active in disaster relief. If you would like to become a distributor, please email us at bugoutamerica@usa.com or call 818-720-0759. We offer free consultations to answer all your questions. Do it today while things are calm. That's AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com.
I don't like words that hide the truth. I don't like words that conceal reality. I don't like euphemisms. And American English is loaded with euphemisms. Because Americans have a lot of trouble dealing with reality. Americans have trouble facing the truth. So they invent a kind of a soft language to protect themselves from it. I'll give you an example of that. When I was a little kid, if I got sick, they wanted me to go to the hospital and see the doctor. Now they want me to go to a health maintenance organization. Smug, greedy, well-fed white people have invented a language to conceal their sins. It's as simple as that. The CIA doesn't kill anybody anymore. They neutralize people. The government doesn't lie. It engages in disinformation. Israeli murderers are called commandos. Arab commandos are called terrorists. Contra killers are called freedom fighters. Well, if crime fighters fight crime and firefighters fight fire, what do freedom fighters fight? They never mention that part of it to us, do they? Never mention that part of it.
You're listening to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, the network who perseveres in delivering intelligent debate, constructive dialogue with true independence. The freedom to broadcast the truth is not free at all. So what is American Freedom Radio worth to you? The empowering information with fun, honest and pure integrity behind it provides an example to follow. Friendships to flourish with the moral altruism that pulls no punches. The hosts sacrifice and show remarkable discipline in their duty to deliver quality radio in service to the community with strength, wisdom, and loyalty. The founders of AFR wish to thank you personally for sharing your views and insights to make the best radio and alternative media. Now it's time for you to give something back and play a vital role in the future of America. Be as generous with us as we've been with you. Click on the donate banner at AmericanFreedomRadio.com. or volunteer by emailing AmericanFreedomRadio.com. Vaccine, psychotropic drugs, and artillery batteries not included.
Launch sequence initiated.
We're now in the approach phase. Everything looking good. Control is good. 5, roger, copy. 3, 2, 1, engage.
Prepare your mind to experience American Freedom Radio. Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything: geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody. Pierce Redmond here for Porkins Policy Radio. If you are just joining us here in the second hour, we are speaking with Paul Dobson of VenezuelaAnalysis.com. We have been discussing, in the first hour we were discussing this terrorist attack on President Maduro's life involving drones. We're talking about some of this terrifying cast of characters that is involved in this and an ongoing investigation. And towards the end there, Paul, you mentioned this character who I had nearly forgotten about when I was taking notes and doing a little research on this Tabosky guy who lives in Miami. He has been named by Maduro's government in the investigation as, I guess, as sort of the financial backer behind much of this. So he's accused of providing money, possibly for the drones. I mean, there's a lot of logistical stuff as well. I mean, people say, oh well, whatever, it's just $5,000 isn't that much, for these drones. But you also got to figure you got to pay the drone, pilots. You've got to guys that, getaway cars. I mean, these things add up. You also have to just pay people to keep their mouth shut, as well, So all of this costs money, and this character Tabosky is alleged to have been behind all this. And I wanted to just kind of start again with this because the whole Miami connection to this is a fascinating one to me, that Miami is still this kind of hub of right-wing Latin American terrorism. You don't have to go that far back, but of course the Cuban exile community in the 1960s and 70s, it's all based out of Miami. You've got characters like Marco Rubio, who down in Florida, who's continually talking about we have to overthrow Maduro and go after the the communist government in Cuba and stuff like that. But I just, Paul, explain a little bit to the listeners, how this functions in Miami and how Miami is this kind of hub of right-wing terrorism when it comes to the Caribbean and Latin America. Explain a little bit about the whole kind of Miami connection to this.
Well, it's difficult to know exactly how this works in Miami, obviously, unless you're there and you're involved in the networks there, no? As any of your listeners who has visited Miami will surely know, Miami is mostly bilingual. There is, you speak Spanish in most places. Mm-hmm. It's also a very wealthy state. There's a lot of the American wealth generally flows through Miami. Which, when you combine it with the exiled or the self-exiled communities, Latin communities, obviously provides excellent sources of financing for their political activities and other extra political activities. What I can say is that here, based in Venezuela, we can see a very serious correlation between the crimes committed by certain political groupings here in Venezuela, and in this I include the 2002 coup d'etat, to include the 2014 and 2017 street violence, and the recent terrorist assassination attack on President Maduro. They often trace back in some way or another to Miami, to Florida. No? Obviously, to fund these sort of activities, you need a sizable amount of money, which is not readily available here in Venezuela, especially under the current economic situation we're living through here. Have to come from outside of the country. And there are people in Miami who both have the political interest and the finances to be able to support these groupings. When we look at the recent assassination attempt, the terrorist attack of the 4th of August, it's not a coincidence that two Miami-based television networks publicized the assassination attempt. One read a report an hour afterwards, and another one professed to have known about the attack before it even happened. No, this is not surprising for us here in Venezuela. No, we're not talking about New York, we're not talking about Seattle, we're not talking about Atlanta, we're not talking about Boston, we're talking about Miami. Always Miami. No, it's also worth pointing out this is a very popular emigration destination for rich Venezuelans, anti-government Venezuelans who have the capacity to travel to the United States and set up a life there. Will mostly do so in Miami rather than any other part of the country. So there's a good support base for these sort of policies in that area, which are headed up by or represented by Marco Rubio, no? Who is very vocal in his support for these sort of aggressive, violent policies at times. Marco Rubio, who has called on the Venezuelan armed forces to rise up against Maduro, effectively calling for a coup d'etat, as far as I understand his wording, no? In public against a democratically elected government. This is outrageous. This is beyond belief.
Oh, yeah, it's again, just imagine the script is flipped. I mean, it's crazy. And this should go without saying. Miami is also just a sort of hotbed for, CIA operations, of course, going back to the Cuban exile community in the 1960s. You also got a lot of drug trafficking, with CIA fingerprints happening in Miami. So yeah, I mean, it should come as no surprise that, it is still being used as a destination point, for money and shady operations in Latin America. And, I'll just point out too that, Tabosky, the financier possibly of this recent attack, lives in Miami, but I believe owns like two businesses in Venezuela, which I believe have now been seized by the government.
He owns a series of businesses and properties here, including two very large private medical clinics. Yes, they have been seized as part of the ongoing investigation into him. Also, the Venezuelan government has formally requested that the American government capture and extradite this figure. There is an extradition treaty between these two countries. It now is a responsibility of the U.S. government, of Trump and so on, to fulfill this. We'll wait and see whether this happens, but I'm skeptical to say the least. We just have to look back at the case of Luis Posada Carriles,
yes, which
year after year the Venezuelan government were requesting extradition, and it never happened. And obviously he passed away in a very comfortable home in the United States. I think also in Miami, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely. So right, exactly. And very, very interesting too, the FBI offering, to help with this, and, hopefully they'll pick up Maduro's calls and, help with this investigation. But moving on a little bit,
only time will tell.
Right, exactly. Sort of in the same vein though, we've also got, a lot of operations and stuff obviously happening out of Miami. And these are of a more clandestine nature, more secretive nature. We're talking about, bombings, terrorist attacks, things like that. But, more broadly speaking, and I think too, and I don't want to get too kind of into CIA, stuff when it comes to Venezuela, although obviously, there's plenty out there on that. And I think that, when it comes to things like the 2002 coup, obviously the U.S., and I can only assume, the CIA and military intelligence were deeply involved in what was going on there when Chavez was, removed from power for like 48 hours. And, there's plenty more. I mean, Chavez's, very strange, death from cancer as well. But, I think that's kind of been explored a fair amount. And we kind of are aware that obviously the CIA has a vendetta against any kind of, leftist, revolutionary group, or political, government, anything like that. But, in terms of the economic warfare, because this is something that I think is sort of overlooked time and time again when talking about places, especially like Venezuela and the economic situation there. People will admit, well, yes, of course, the CIA tries to overthrow these countries, but, when it comes to the economic crisis, there's no one ever, or not no one, but a lot of people, a lot of the narrative in the West and elsewhere will be that, well, this is just the cause of, these terrible socialist policies. That there's no external, actors or groups that are influencing the economy or orchestrating certain economic events within Venezuela. I'll point out again, July of this year, Trump was repeatedly talking about just, he kept bringing it up apparently in cabinet meetings, why he couldn't just simply invade Venezuela with the U.S. armed forces. He brought this up to Tillerson, McMaster, and others. So we know that is obviously on the table as well. But Paul, let's talk about the economic warfare that's going on. A big one that we hear time and time again, is that, everyone in Venezuela is starving to death. There's no food. People are in line just for a loaf of stale bread at the grocery store. I've seen these, reports in mainstream outlets. They're, people are, roving the streets looking for stray dogs. People are eating their pets. Very much the kind of cartoonish, reports that we get out of North Korea where, they're eating each other. And this, of course, is, this is because of socialism. This is the Bolivarian revolution, in its truest, most naked form. But obviously, I think you have to kind of take a step back and really look at the larger picture here and see that a lot of this is being orchestrated, not in Venezuela, but in, Western cities and European banks. So let's talk a little bit about, the food crisis, that is, happening in Venezuela. What is the true reality of this, Paul?
Well, this is a massive issue, Pierce. I think we could dedicate a 10-hour program to this, and we maybe wouldn't even get to the bottom of it. But the reality is this. The reality is that, yes, in Venezuela there are serious, deep-rooted economic problems at the moment. There is shortages of certain isolated goods. Yes, this exists. There are, to access certain goods, procedures, which often involve long queues or involve quotas, daily quotas for these goods, isolated goods. We're not talking generalized here, no? Mechanisms to access these goods or subsidized goods. This is a reality, no? To say that Venezuelans are starving, that this is Ethiopia, that there's a famine, this is false. This is false, no? There is, without a doubt, an economic crisis in Venezuela, which has been going on for some years. Recession, hyperinflation, wages are increasingly devalued in terms of consumer power. No? This is a reality. No one is hiding this, and no one should look to either. What I think is more interesting is when we look to the reasons behind this. No? We have various narratives behind this reality to explain this reality. We have the narrative coming out of the mainstream press outlets, most of which are financed by some Western government, which basically says this only started with the socialism of Nicolas Maduro. Before, a few years ago, they said, this only started with the socialism of Hugo Chavez. Well, now they forgot about that. Now they said this only started with Nicolas Maduro, okay? That's one narrative. We have another narrative coming out of the Venezuelan government, which is, this only started when the White House started their sanctions against us. It's their fault. No? Personally, I think neither of these are true. I think it's a much more complex picture, involving certain truths of both camps, but there's a whole load of other elements involved which go to explain this situation. The roots in the Venezuelan monoproductive economy, which had based itself around oil since the 1950s. the migration out of Venezuela in the last 3 or 4 years of significant productive apparatus, the educational problems, which have been excellent in certain sectors of the economy, but have been massively deficient in other sectors of the economy, corruption in the public institutions, which have seen a lot of interesting, productive economic projects halted or put the brakes on at some point during their process, obviously to the detriment of the people. And one of the most recent phenomena is, without a doubt, the international campaign against Venezuela to isolate Caracas, to restrict its access to all sorts of international funding, credit, or even the financial apparatus which the world uses, the banking system, the shareholders, and all of the financial apparatus which goes with these systems, which of course Caracas, like any other government in the world, has to some extent use if they want to be a part of the world.
Right, and we should point out too, Julio Borges is he was caught, writing all of these letters to banks like banks in Germany, the U.S., the U.K., lobbying, saying don't do business with us.
He was indeed, yes.
Which is outrageous. Again, this is the imagine if this is like the equivalent of like the Speaker of the House in the United States. Going around to Western governments and massive Western banks and saying, don't do business with America, so that we will ultimately suffer more. A man like that has a tremendous amount of influence, especially when he's so connected to that world, talking about, finance and things like that. He's a wealthy individual. He is connected to that. So his voice carries a lot of weight. But that's actively going on all the time. So, things like the World Bank have routinely screwed over Venezuela. Like you said, I agree. I don't think it's just sanctions. I don't think it's just the socialist policies. There's a myriad of factors that would take way too long. But, just trying to keep that in mind for people out there, because it's such a skewed view when it comes to economics in Venezuela. And again, it's like people are incapable of admitting to themselves that, when you isolate a country, it's the same thing like in Iran, they will use all of these, this is why it's those crazy ayatollahs. That's who's destroying the economy. When, you make it illegal for virtually any other country, outside of a handful, like Russia, China, some Central Asian countries as well, to do business with Iran, then yes, obviously the people are going to suffer. We mentioned at the top of the show, Paul, that, today is a call to action in terms of the, U.S. sanctions. Briefly touch on that because, while U.S. sanctions are this, beloved tool of the sort of Washington foreign policy establishment. And while it's always, we're going after terrorists, we're going after dictators and political figures, none of those people are really affected by sanctions for the most part. Sanctions are really actually affecting the very same people that they, claim to want to, help. And ultimately, a lot of times, sanctions reinforce people that might even be critical of the Maduro's government. But, it forces them to support the government because look at what's happening. You can't get basic medicine and things like that. So talk about how sanctions affect, average Venezuelans.
The U.S. government has claimed these sanctions are directed to certain personalities and therefore do not affect the Venezuelan people. This is completely false. This is a lie. I live in Venezuela. I'm on the ground here, and this is a lie. I'm affected by these U.S. sanctions. A lot of my friends are, my family are. This is a reality. I have a series of friends who rely on certain treatments, medical treatments, which are imported into the country. Venezuela produces very little in terms of specialist medical treatment. Imported into the country, and now they can't be imported into the country because the entity which previously imported these medicines, be it public or private, the state or a private business, now cannot pay for these medicines because they normally pay for them using the banking apparatus of, I don't know, Citibank or a certain Swiss bank, or, you know, these banking conglomerates which control the international financial apparatus of the world. It is now illegal for Citibank, it's just one example, no, to receive a payment from Venezuela. They will be going against US law and will be liable to criminal proceedings. Therefore, the Venezuelan private firm which previously imported a certain medicine, one of the most prominent cases here in Venezuela is for Parkinson's medicine, now cannot import this medicine, let alone the Venezuelan state, who could previously import from the same suppliers. No? What is the end result of this? The medicine isn't arriving. Who's suffering from this? The people who have Parkinson's, the people who have cancer, the people who have all of these other horrendous diseases and conditions,
and the
are suffering
ones.
as a result of these sanctions. Yeah. Another example. Let's talk about another example. At the moment, in the city I live in, Venezuela, there are significant queues to fill your tank with gasoline, with petrol, as we call it in Britain. Why? So I don't know much about this. So whenever I go and I fill out the tank on my motorbike, I ask the person at the gas station, "Why is there such a long queue today?" And the answer is nearly always the same. The answer is U.S. sanctions. I said, what are U.S. sanctions against President Maduro got to do with me having to queue to get some petrol or get some gas into my tank? He says, for the Venezuela produces a lot of oil. This is a standard answer I get. Venezuela produces a lot of oil. For this oil to then be refined and processed into either diesel or gas for your vehicles, it includes a certain number of additives. No? These additives are produced by the Venezuelan state oil company, PDVSA, but they're mostly produced in its U.S. subsidiary, Citgo. No? At the moment, due to U.S. sanctions, it is impossible for Citgo to send these additives back to Venezuela, to their parent company, and therefore there are problems with supply of Venezuelan gas. No? Due to the sanctions, due to the fact that Venezuela at the moment cannot pay for anything which it looks to import from the US or any private company which has a base in the US. No? We've seen Indian companies which have a legal footing in the US withdraw from major deals in Venezuela, medical deals to send medicine to Venezuela, because they're worried that they might suffer sanctions in the US for doing so. So who is suffering? The people with a disease, the people with the conditions, the people who have to queue for 3 or 4 hours to fill their car up with gas. You know? I very much doubt that President Maduro is suffering. I very much doubt that his cabinet is suffering. The vice president, I'm sure they're eating fine and so on in their palaces. I'm sure they are. The people who are suffering are the people like myself, my friends, the people on the street, no, who can't find a repair part for their car because they're imported, who can't find an important medical procedure because they're imported. And anything at the moment which is imported is getting increasingly difficult to find because it mostly came from the United States.
Well, and also, like you point out too, is that any foreign company that either operates in the U.S. or even just wants to at some point, you know, or wants to do business in the U.S. Can't do business with Venezuela because they're afraid of U.S. sanctions. I mean, that's also crazy too, in a sense that, you know, these sanctions are restricting countries as far away as India. I mean, you know, it's so far removed from the goings on, the machinations of, you know, the political situation in Venezuela, but they can't do business there. I mean, major banks, you know, which is not to like defend Citibank at all. I mean, they're a horrible institution, but there's something so crazy when, you know, Citibank wants to work with this evil socialist country, but they can't because America is restricting them. And like you said, the fact that this is really kind of trickling down to average people and making them suffer and making their lives, you know, just unbearable. You know, I don't really I don't quite understand the logic behind, you know, sanctions, because I think a lot of time it actually makes, you know, many times it forces people to support the government even more, because they ultimately see, well, as bad as this guy is, what the U.S. sanctions are doing are even worse. It has an opposite effect. It's really just about collective punishment. It's about, making poor people in Venezuela suffer because, a bunch of rich white politicians in America don't like Nicolas Maduro for whatever, reason.
I think it's also worth pointing out that sanctions have secondary effects, let's say, which include, for example, economic deterrence, as you point out. It's about putting in a very strong deterrent for any private capital firm to come and work in Venezuela. And also it's about setting the terrain for what's to come. I think this is very important that we look at the correlation between US sanctions and let's say more aggressive US policies. We could name, for example, Iraq, Syria, to mention just a few, Afghanistan, Libya,
Yemen,
or others. No, the destruction of the local economy, the massive incentives to push all sort of foreign direct investment out of Venezuela, to isolate the Venezuelan economy, will create the social basis whereby any sort of drastic change in Venezuelan government may well be more widely accepted than it is today. There are undoubtedly Venezuelans out there who are saying, I support Maduro, I support Chavismo, but, I can't deal with this anymore. Whatever has to change, If this means installing a government which will talk to the White House, then maybe this is a case. Undoubtedly these people exist. I don't know how numerous they are. But this is a sort of ethos which the sanctions are trying to promote. This sort of loggerheading between Caracas and Washington, making people's lives so difficult that they will accept any sort of change, which, if we look at Brazil and we look at Argentina, brought with it IMF investment policies, brought with them the World Bank, brought with them neoliberal restructuring of the economy, unemployment, and so on and so on and so on. But there are certain sectors of the Brazilian Argentinian population which would have supported these at the beginning, because they felt it was necessary at that point. And this is the sort of ethos which the sanctions are trying to instigate amongst Venezuelans.
Oh, and right, and the second you accept those IMF or World Bank loans, I mean, there's so many horrible loopholes and caveats that they put in there that basically just ensure that you will never be able to, be free from these loans. And they also put all sorts of crazy restrictions on how businesses can be run, on how, where businesses can take loans from, what the interest rate on these loans are. I mean, it's really kind of, it's like extortion, basically.
Sure.
It is like a sort of mafia, local gang figure coming in, basically, forcing you to buy protection money. And then once you do, they want more and more and more. And like you said, I mean, that's what happened in Brazil. That's what happened in Argentina back in the 90s, when they accepted all sorts of ridiculous, loans from the IMF, basically out of, desperation. There was no one else available. Which is crazy. And just to any of the people out there that always constantly harping on about the free market and stuff like that, but will also support these U.S. sanctions. I mean, this is, this should be tantamount to, this is like the opposite of your so-called free market. I only bring that up just because I still hear people kind of harping on about that, but, using all these things, you're destroying the market. That would gladly work with Venezuela. So, please I don't want to hear any more. I got a bunch of comments about that recently. So that aside, the sanctions are just sort of insane and nutty. And
they're entirely political. They're entirely political, Piers.
Yeah.
They're about bringing about political change in the direction of Venezuela and, ergo, a political change in the direction and the control of Venezuelans' natural resources. The oil, the gas, the water, the diamonds, the gold and everything else, the immense natural resources we have here in Venezuela. And they're interventionary. They're about the White House trying to impose themselves on a free, independent, sovereign country. Hmm? This should be opposed by anybody who loves democracy, anybody who believes in democracy.
Yeah. Oh, no, certainly. And there's also, there's you can even go into another sort of insidious thing where you look at like things like in Haiti, where the local economy there is it doesn't exist anymore. The entire economy and, lifeblood of Haiti is entirely reliant upon UN aid. So, there is no local economy in Haiti. There are no people that are making, food. There's no bread makers in Haiti. There's no one that's selling rice. You go to a UN facility and get rice, that's a lot of time is awful quality, or you get, fucking cholera, from, the UN soldiers that are based there. And I think there's a nature of that as well in Venezuela, pushing them to the extent where they would then, accept any kind of aid package, no matter how bad it is, and then again you become completely dependent upon a foreign entity, be it the White House, be it the UN, be it the IMF, any of these organizations. And it is about, like you said, it's a political goal to control Venezuela and all of the vast natural resources. And this should come as no surprise too that these countries with huge natural resources that are always, quote, failing. Look at the reality of that. They're failing because they're being set up to fail. That's the case in Yemen. Which has tremendous natural resources, but of course they're never going to let them come out. Look at Iraq, remember? That was supposed to be, the war will pay for itself. Well, no, we've just ensured that no oil comes out of Iraq, which I assume is if that's what they would do at Venezuela. If they can't control Venezuela like that, then, again, there is a lot of money in Venezuela in terms of the oil industry, but like you said, it's crazy that you have to queue to get gasoline for your car in a country that's that oil rich. That should give you a sense of the pressure that's being exerted on Venezuela.
And it creates a very superficial contradiction. We could describe it this way, which a lot of Venezuelans are falling into the trap of believing, saying exactly what you just said. How is it fair that we have to queue to get gas for our cars when our country has got so much oil? But this, why do I call this superficial? Because it doesn't take into account that for this oil to then be processed into gas, it needs a certain number of additives, and there's a certain procedure which has to undergo, and these additives aren't coming into Venezuela at the moment. Therefore, the whole process is collapsing. No? I think it's also, while we're talking on this, Piers, it's also interesting to look at a certain point at the response of the Venezuelan government, or response of the Venezuelan people, I should say, to these sanctions, because Venezuela is not Iraq, Venezuela is not Libya or Afghanistan. Venezuela is a country with access to a significant amount of wealth. Venezuela is a country with extremely developed and deep-rooted popular organizations, grassroots organizations. It is a country which we could say to certain levels has a popular element or a people's element in government. Obviously this is a more contentious claim, I would say. But it's a highly democratic country with elections, on average, one election a year, if not a little bit more, 1.3 elections a year, something like this. It's a country which has, or had at one point, a very well developed agricultural base. I'm talking here back in the 60s, more or less. And it's a country with extensive levels of know-how, technological know-how, and other elements of the economy, which is very well equipped to pick up on. But the response of the government to these economic ills, I think it would be fair to describe it as watery at some point, or not maybe as strong as many people are clamoring for. No? There's been a very strong discourse from the government about diversifying the economy, starting to produce these sort of elements which we've never produced here for the last 50 years. These additives to gasoline, these medicines which we used to have to import, and so on. There's been a very good discourse from the government about this, diversifying the economy. But the actions which have followed the discourse have been half-hearted. And these half-hearted actions have been even further watered down by corrupt local officials, we could say, by sectors within the government who don't really agree with this, who prefer to keep Venezuela on this path for own personal reasons. Minute sectors within the government, but these exist without a doubt. So the reaction of the Venezuelan government to this sort of international isolation has, in some elements, I would say, been successful, but in other elements has been far from successful, and has a lot further to go if they look to unveil or to show up these sanctions and the people behind these sanctions for what they really are.
No, like we said earlier, we could probably do 10 hours on the economic problems and situation in Venezuela and just sort of scratch the surface. And I'm glad too you point out, that there's corruption everywhere. There are corrupt people within Maduro's government. I think sometimes people kind of categorize it as a sort of monolithic entity, which is never a good idea when you're talking about politics and things like that. You mentioned there before, Paul, this sort of vibrant, political activism within Venezuela, which has existed for many, many years, and I certainly wanted to touch on that. Here in like the final half hour of the show, at least somewhat, because this I think, like the economic problems of Venezuela, is one of the other sort of overlooked or simplified or just simply wrong, narratives that we hear coming out of the West. When it comes to politics in Venezuela, it's seen as it's this dictatorship. It's a one-party system. Everyone that believes in either, the Bolivarian Revolution, Chavez, Maduro, they're all brainwashed cult members. They don't think for themselves. And it's only this, rich, right-wing European, minority, in Venezuela that can solve all of the problems. And, I know that you, are a bit of an expert when it comes to the electoral system in Venezuela, and, how that really operates. And I wanted you to just, I know we don't have much time, but talk a little bit about that. Particularly too, we mentioned earlier the Constituent Assembly, which, was brought up in 2017 during the so-called constitutional crisis in Venezuela, and that also erupted in very violent protests afterwards. But talk a little bit about the political system in Venezuela, because we get such a skewed interpretation or viewpoint of that here in the West.
Well, the first thing to point out is that there were a sector of political parties and groupings and grassroots movements here in Venezuela which support the government, and also another very vibrant, very vocal sector which oppose the government. Those supporting the government are generally grouped into an organization called the Great Patriotic Pole. Within this organization there are 8 different political parties, obviously including the party of government, which is the United Socialist Party, but 7 other political parties. There are something like 45,000 organizations signed up into this Great Patriotic Pole. Academic organizations, farmers' movements, women's groups, communal councils, which are community-based, very localized community-based organic organizations, a whole range of organizations. On the other side of the coin, on the right-wing side of Venezuelan politics, we had until recently a coalition called the United Democratic Roundtable. Ironically, in Spanish, the abbreviation of this was MUD, M-U-D, which means something very different in Spanish, but anyway. So the MUD organization, which is now to some extent collapsed into or divided into various different alliances, brought together something like 20 different right-wing political parties and university groupings and pressure groupings and NGOs and so on and so on and so on. No? So there's a very vibrant political life here. On the pro-government side, there has been in recent months a very interesting debate going on, which is specifically this: how are we going to overcome this economic crisis? So these are people who support the government, who support the Bolivarian process, who have started to voice with more force certain criticisms of government policies in the economic sphere. No? A major example of this was, and this is largely been forgotten because of the assassination attempt, very unfortunately, but I would encourage all of your listeners to check it out, to do a quick Google search or to go to venezuelanalysis.com and have a look at this. There was a farmers' march which a few days before the assassination attempt against Maduro culminated a 453-kilometer march to Caracas just to speak with the president. These are pro-government activists, farmers, very small-scale farmers, who took up a few beans, a bit of rice, and decided to walk to Caracas, from all the different parts of the country. There was, I think, about 12 different states represented in this march, and they got to Caracas, and after a bit of a few problems they had arriving on Caracas, they managed to sit down with the president, and on live TV, they said to him everything they wanted to say. And this is a huge event for Venezuela. This event has been called the most important political event in the last recent history of Venezuelan politics. The pro-government supporting groups, the grassroots groups, sitting down with the people in power and telling them exactly what is going on in the countryside. What the problems are. The problems of corruption, the problems of the landlords, the problems of corrupt local officials, and so on and so on and so on. The official government programs which aren't working, and so on. And this was a very important step in this internal debate I just mentioned between the grassroots support base of the government, which continues to support the government in a massive majority, but is now starting to see that support brings with it the right to constructively criticize. These are not mutually exclusive concepts. No? Mm. And so when we see, for example, a recent strike by public sector electrical workers, this is not an anti-government strike. This is not a strike in support of IMF policies. This is a strike saying, government, pull your socks up, do things a little bit better. We propose you do this, this, and this. Listen to us. We're the people on the ground. And this is sort of the vibrant nature or the dynamism of Venezuelan politics at the moment. We're at a very interesting crossroads. The government is looking to see which road it's going to take. We see the government at the moment sitting down with big business leaders, with right-wing leaders, but also with left-wing leaders, farmers, workers, and so on and so on. And I'd be interested to see where the government take the economy in the next few years. And to how they try to resolve these economic problems.
Well, and this should just, I hope this is illustrating that, politics in Venezuela, in a lot of ways is, far more advanced than much of the Western system. I mean, can you actually imagine that ever happening, in England or here in the U.S. or Canada or elsewhere? I mean, no, you would never have, farmers marching to Washington and sitting down with Donald Trump unless, it was, predetermined that they would, just for a nice photo op and they wouldn't ask him any actual real questions. Beyond that too, Paul, there is a fair amount of, active participation, from a, very local level all the way up to the national government with average people. And again, we don't, we get this impression that, they're blocking, the right-wing groups from participating in this. But, time and time again, groups, like the First Justice Party, they boycott elections. They don't want to participate. So, you can't really say that they're not actively, they don't have an active voice when they refuse to actually join in things like the Constituent Assembly, and instead they start, burning cars in Caracas and attacking protesters. So just talk a little bit about that, the sort of like, on a very local level, at how active people are.
Well, the participation on a local level is one of the major figureheads of the Bolivarian process here in Venezuela, which started in 1999. Many have claimed that in recent years this has died, this has been dampened down. And this is not true. The popular participation is as live as it ever has been here in Venezuela. And when you compare what's going on a local level and within these groupings, the communal councils, the communes, women's groups, activist groups, ecological groups, and so on, we're starting to see increasing strength, let's say, in discourse with that of the government policy. So whereas before we would see a lot of these groups echoing or making a reality the instructions which President Chavez gave to the country and to his supporters. Now what we're seeing is people starting to stand up within their own organizations and saying, I think this should be done, or we think this should be done. Let's tell Maduro that we think this should be done. So this is a new level of participation of the people in the policies which the national government is looking to take. It's not a top-down policy, but it's, to some extent, in terms of solving the economic problems, it has become an even more bottom-up policy. No? And this is very important. The Farmers' March I just mentioned is a very good example of this. This is not a perfect process, of course. There are problems. There are middle-range politicians who obstruct this process, without a doubt. Without a doubt. It's not an easy process, but it exists and is very vibrant. And this is something which I think you see in very few other Western representative democracies, we could say. And it's very interesting to develop and to look into a little bit more.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that something should be said too, that this is an ongoing process that you just said started in 1999. Any kind of revolutionary movement, anything that's drastically changing the system of government and all that stuff, it's never going to be it's not going to happen super quick. It's not going to always be nice and pleasant. But in the long term, or in the looking at it from the perspective of other revolutionary movements, it is relatively peaceful in Venezuela compared to tons of other forms of government that sort of tried to radically change the status quo. And as you said,
one of the elements here which numerous people, I haven't quite decided if I agree with them, but numerous opinions I've heard criticize the Bolivarian government is that it is overly inclusive, and that there is extensive and far too much freedom of speech. In Venezuela, libel suits almost don't exist. You can say in the press pretty much whatever you want to say. I've seen people come out publicly in the press calling for the president to be assassinated, which in any other part of the world would be a libel suit. I've seen.
Well, you go to jail for that.
Exactly. I've seen the president. I've seen public authorities encouraging their competition, their foes, their right-wing groupings, to participate in the elections, to come and join the club, if you like, to stand up and measure themselves. The recent elections, as you pointed out, was a good example of this. The government on numerous occasions, as well as all of their allied parties on the left, encouraged the right-wing parties to participate. They had constitutional guarantees. They were perfectly entitled to. There was no problem there whatsoever. Now, if these certain sectors of the right-wing grouping decided not to participate, that's their own sovereign decision. That's fine. But it's worth pointing out that there were significant sectors of the other of the right which did participate. The right-wing groupings had 2 of the 4 presidential candidates in May, for example. Of the 4 candidates, 2 were left-wing, 2 were right-wing. Venezuelans had a very ample choice. No, they chose a left-wing candidate, but this is not because there was a dictator. It's not because they were forced to do so. They had an option. No, the electoral system has been declared one of the best in the world. Not my words; these are the words of international electoral experts, including the Carter Foundation. It's transparent. It's free, fair. It's an electronic system here. It's an independent system which is not related to government. It doesn't depend on the government infrastructure for elections to work. There is no government funding of political parties or anything like this. No, and the technological level of the apparatus is top class. The guarantees put in place to avoid any sort of irregularities are second to none. And again, not my words; these are the words of the international observers who come to every single Venezuelan election. Where are the international observers in the U.S. elections? Where are the international observers guaranteeing the British elections? No? What would they say if they were there? So for these sort of powers to then come out and criticize Venezuela can be criticized for a whole range of things which would be justifiable. Maduro can be criticized for a whole range of things which may be justifiable. But being a dictator is definitely not one of them.
No, the election thing is also something whenever I get into an argument with people, is that, even the right wing doesn't deny the, openness of the elections. I mean, they're not contesting it like, oh, they're stuffing ballot boxes. And some of the times because they didn't even participate, so, at that point, I mean, I don't know what they could say, but, the other issue here is that he is just Maduro is wildly popular. Like you said, I mean, no one is contesting. It's not like there's an election, like just the recent elections in Pakistan, for instance. I mean, clearly, there was something going on. And Imran Khan's win was massaged at best. But the same way that, every freaking local election here in the U.S., there's always allegations of tampering, of irregularities with the voting machines. I mean, we don't see that in places like Venezuela. And as you point out, international observers, all these things. I mean, so again, that's not the real question here. I mean, the question here is, as you pointed out in the first hour, why the right wing continues to fail. They've tried every method. They've tried, legitimate political means, protesting, trying to kill the president, overthrowing the country. I mean, none of these things succeed. Which I think should tell you something. Paul, we're coming up just at the end. I think we've got maybe about 5-6 minutes left. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to mention anything that we didn't get to, anything that you want to just sort of leave the listeners with in terms of what's going on in Venezuela, and maybe just why the West fears an independent Venezuela.
Yeah, well, I think two elements here. I just wanted to leave your listeners with. Firstly, anybody who consider themselves, let's say, leaning to the left or interested in progressive policies in the US and beyond, would learn a lot by looking into the case of Venezuela. Like I said before, this is not a perfect case, of course not. There are many problems going on, both self-caused problems and caused externally. But the internal political dynamic, the power dynamic, which is developed in Venezuela over the last 20 years or so, is fascinating. And it can teach us a lot about progressiveness and participative democracy and a whole range of other political concepts. So I'd encourage your listeners to study a little bit more into Venezuela. Even come here and visit us here in Venezuela. Your listeners are always welcome to come and see for themselves what's going on here and see whether the reality of what they see here correlates with what they're being told back in the mainstream press. So this is the first element I wanted to leave them with. The second element is that it's very important to remember that the stakes in Venezuela are massively high. Mostly due to the oil, but due to a whole range of other factors as well. Which basically means that any sort of headline you read about Venezuela in the mainstream press will nearly always have something behind it. So we always encourage the readers of Venezuela Analysis, but also your listeners, to be critical, to try to look behind the headlines and try to see the intentions and what is actually going on there for themselves, and to evaluate as intelligent thinking beings. For example, one good example of this I often use is that the Venezuelan government for some years now has been self-describing themselves as socialist. They've not been described by anyone else as socialist, let's say, from other sectors. They've described themselves as socialist. So beyond just assuming that they are socialist, and therefore certain policy isn't working because it is a socialist policy, we should look a little bit beyond that and go, are they actually socialist? Right. Is what they're doing actually socialism? Without getting into debate about the definition of socialism and so on and so on. But I see very few genuinely socialist policies coming out of the government, both in the time of Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro. I think they'd be much more accurate to describe them to some extent as patriotic, social reformist maybe. But this is a big debate. But to disregard the success of what they are currently doing, or to generalize these failures, which undoubtedly exist, to generalize them into failures of socialism, suggests that they are indeed socialist. When you start to question this, we start to look at things in a new light, okay? And this is a very important element in, let's say, the battle of ideas, as Hugo Chavez referred to it, the battle for hearts and minds, he also referred to it at one point, which is about convincing people or demonstrating the rightness or the correctness of progressive policies over policies which prefer and prioritize big capital and the richer classes.
Excellent. And I just want to echo everything that Paul was just saying there. Also, quickly tell everybody where they can go to find all of your work. I assume it's all at VenezuelaAnalysis.com, but let the listeners know if there's any other ways that they can find your work or to get in contact with you.
Yeah, they can find us on their website, VenezuelaAnalysis.com, that's one word. They can also follow us on social media, do a quick search for us on Twitter, on Facebook. It's worth pointing out that our Facebook account was blocked this week by Facebook, alongside Telesur and Haiti Analysis as well. But I think our account is now up and running again, but Facebook have been trying to censor our coverage of Venezuela. So look us up on Facebook, on Twitter. You can send us an email, editor@VenezuelaAnalysis.com. We're reliant 100% on donations to keep our independent reporting of Venezuelan affairs. So anybody who feels that they can help us out financially, you can find out all the information on our website on how to do that.
Excellent. Once again, VenezuelaAnalysis.com, and I want to thank Paul Dobson for joining me on today's show, and I will definitely have him back on the show again soon. So thank you all so much for listening, and I'll be talking to you very soon.
No rules. No taboo topics. No fear of doom. We are American Freedom Radio.
Simply Clean Foods is dedicated to providing the best quality food you can buy next to fresh from a farmer's market. Our stringent quality controls and absolute zero GMOs plus testing for heavy metals makes us unique in the storable foods market. Our line of fruits, vegetables, and meats are suitable for everyday use, and you won't have to worry about throwing away valuable groceries ever again. Take out the amount you need and reseal the package for use within the next 6 months. Simply Clean Foods' primary focus is to bring clean food to people all around the world and change the way we look at freeze-dried food in our daily cooking. Go to simplycleanfoods.net. That's www.simplycleanfoods.net today.
This is Rick Simpson, and you're listening to American Freedom Radio.
American Survival Wholesale is a proud sponsor of the American Freedom Radio. And when you purchase quality products from AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com, you help support this program. Our quality non-GMO foods do not contain MSG, high fructose corn syrup, or heavy metals. At American Survival Wholesale, you can choose from over 8,000 quality products, including self-defense weapons, bug-out bags, and long-term storable food at wholesale prices. We also have custom food packs available, including gluten-free, dairy-free, and vegetarian packs. If we don't have it, you don't need it. American Survival Wholesale is a veteran-owned and operated company which also supports our veterans in need, and we are very active in disaster relief. If you would like to become a distributor, please email us at bugoutamerica@usa.com or call 818-720-0759. We offer free consultations to answer all your questions. Do it today while things are calm. That's AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com.
Assassination. You know what's interesting about assassination? Well, not only does it change those popularity polls in a big hurry, but it's also interesting to notice who it is we assassinate. You ever notice who it is? Stop to think of who it is we kill. It's always people who've told us to live together in harmony and try to love one another. Jesus, Gandhi, Lincoln, John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, John Lennon. They all said, try to live together peacefully. Bam! Right in the head. Apparently we're not ready for that. Yeah, that's difficult behavior for us. We're too busy sitting around trying to think up ways to kill each other. Here's one we came up with. It's efficient, too. Genocide, you know? Killing large numbers of people simply because they don't look like you, they don't talk like you, and they don't have the same kind of hats you do. You ever notice that anytime you see two groups of people who really hate each other, chances are good they're wearing different kind of hats. Keep an eye on that. It might be important.
You're listening to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, the network who perseveres in delivering intelligent debate, constructive dialogue with true independence. The freedom to broadcast the truth is not free at all. So what is American Freedom Radio worth to you? The empowering information with fun, honest and pure integrity behind it provides an example to follow, friendships to flourish, with the moral altruism that pulls no punches. The hosts sacrifice and show remarkable discipline in their duty to deliver quality radio in service to the community with strength, wisdom, and loyalty. The founders of AFR wish to thank you personally for sharing your views and insights to make the best radio and alternative media. Now it's time for you to give something back and play a vital role in the future of America. Be as generous with us as we've been with you. Click on the donate banner at AmericanFreedomRadio.com or volunteer by emailing AmericanFreedomRadio@ymail.com. Vaccine, psychotropic drugs, and artillery batteries not included.
Launch sequence initiated.
We're now in the approach phase. Everything looking good. Control is good. 5, rocket copy. 3, 2, 1. Okay.
Prepare your mind to experience American Freedom Radio.